be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSE Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Protecting Your IP from Domain, Brand, and Logo Infringements. My name is James Weir, and I will be your moderator. Joining us today are Chris Lincoln, David Barnett, and Lan Huang.
Hello and welcome all to those tuning in to listen and watch. Whether you're working in the industry, a brand owner, a fellow colleague, or someone just interested in the world of brand protection, we have some interesting things to share with you today. So let's introduce myself and our guest. My name is Chris Lincoln. I'm a senior brand protection analyst with CSC. I've been working in the industry for 4.5 years. Over that time, I've worked with numerous brands across various industries to find, analyze, and report potential IP infringements. Joined with me, I'm overjoyed to have a renowned expert in the BP world. He built and originally led up the brand protection team with NetNames. As a veteran in the industry, he has had a significant influence on the approach to analysis and investigation methodologies. He has experience with providing expert consultancy to some of the world's biggest banks and has recently become recognized as CSE's brand monitoring subject matter expert after 15 years of working in the industry. He literally wrote the book on brand protection. Thank you for coming along, Dr. David Barnett. How are you, DB?
Thanks very much. Good to see you, Chris. Yeah, happy to be here.
Good. And what would an IP webinar be without an enforcement expert? Also joined with us, we have a special guest whom initially started as a Chinese-speaking analyst, later became a domain name enforcement guru, and whose research and activities gradually expanded domain enforcement into a globally recognized service for the company. Experience as a key speaker in numerous industrial workshops held by CSC in Munich, Paris, Stockholm, Helsinki, and London, co-hosted numerous webinars with other CSC experts, and has presented as a panelist at the IACC conference to talk about website enforcement in China and the best practice. Our very own domain enforcement subject matter expert, Lan Huang. How are you, Lan?
Thank you very well. Thank you, Chris. That's an epic intro.
Thank you. So we have a few topics that I want to talk about today. Firstly, we will be talking briefly about domain management and how domain monitoring can be the perfect accompaniment to management of your portfolio. Right after that, we'll walk through some key benefits of brand and logo monitoring by taking a look at different types of IP abuse in these areas. We'll be providing insight on the kinds of things that we've been seeing, with a couple of examples broken down, followed with a walkthrough of what we can do about them, and then we can answer some questions. So, without further ado, let's get started. Now, we know that there are a range of important concepts to a brand owner when it comes to considering their IP, and why many of those that we talk to seek out experts or want to know how they can protect their brand. So here we have 3 areas that I've found to be important when it comes to the brand owners I've worked with. So the first one's establishing a brand. So this really boils down to your reach and representation in the desired territories. Then there's maintaining your corporate image. When we think of this, it essentially means that a brand's IP is being used in the right way at a high standard and not in the wrong places. And finally, protection from infringement, which is ensuring things are in place and taking certain measures to prevent and remove infringement of a brand's IP online. In order to have these 3 things, there are a number of standard approaches that companies should be taking to ensure that their brand is correctly represented and protected. The methodologies that we use to monitor and enforce will help with those. And today we're going to go through our experiences and provide you with some insight on these areas. Okay, so let's talk domains. Home is where the domain is. If you have your domain names managed by CSC, then you are probably already working with a strategic account manager who are the experts when it comes to consultancy with domain portfolio management. They will also be a key person to assist with helping to make sure you're set up with the right security measures in place, which is a really hot topic right now. But we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the third point. I know that some of the contacts I've worked with, their primary responsibility in their role is to look after their brand's domains. And generally speaking, you're going to have your essential.coms and relevant CCTLDs. But with around 200 CCTLDs and a massive growth, almost an explosion in TLDs in the recent years, including industry and brand-specific TLDs, there's an awful lot of options to consider. This is where domain monitoring comes in handy. And domain monitoring feeds nicely into balancing your portfolio when considering defensive registrations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So Chris raises a good point there. So obviously, as a brand owner, you're going to want to register the core domains that you want to be using day to day, the ones you're using for your main customer-facing website and so on. And generally speaking, you also want to have some defensive registrations. So those registrations which either relate to things you may want to use in the future or the sorts of things that an infringer may look to register if they're looking to sort of pass themselves off as being you. So, if you're a bank, for example, if you're UK Bank, for example, you might want to register ukbank.com. You might also want to register things like ukbanklogin.com, ukbankonline.com, and a few variations. But obviously, you can never possibly second-guess every possible variant that an infringer might hope to use. So there's always a balance between sort of registering enough domains to kind of keep your kind of core portfolio secure, but then having some proactive monitoring on top of that to catch the other things that people may be registering to try and infringe on your brand.
So I guess that's kind of the point, isn't it? Is getting that perfect balance of registrations and having that monitoring to kind of support what you wouldn't necessarily want to register, what you'd want to keep an eye on, right?
You don't want to spend too much money registering every possible permutation. So it's always a balance between kind of registering the ones that are kind of core and sort of core defensive registrations and then monitoring for the rest.
Exactly. So moving on from that, we're using our in-house technology to monitor for brand domains. We look at thousands of registrations every day to provide a preventative and reactive measure against infringers. DB, you've been with the company a long time, and you've seen how our technology is developed. There's definitely some useful stuff going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about sort of the technical and the data sources we use for our domain monitoring. One of the main sources of information we have are what's called zone files. Now, these are kind of documents or files that are published every day by the operators of each of the TLD registries out there. So each TLD, .com, .net, and so on, they will be operated by a registry company, and every day that company will publish a list of all of the domains that are currently kind of registered across that TLD. We can download and we can inspect those zone files to look for domains, and by essentially comparing today's zone file with yesterday's zone file, we can look for new registrations. So that will allow us to have pretty comprehensive coverage across most of those TLDs where the zone files are available, and that's most of the GTLDs, the global TLDs, and most of the new GTLDs that have been launched over the last few years. For some of the country-specific CCTLDs, zone file access is not always granted by the registries. So in those cases, we fill in some of the gaps by doing what we call parallel lookup. So if we find a domain through a zone file lookup, we can do an equivalent lookup to see if the same equivalently named domain exists across those other CCTLDs, so things like .uk, .de, .fr, and so on. Beyond that, there will still be kind of gaps that we don't find through those routes. So in those cases, what we'll do is we will augment those searches by a sort of internet meta searching. So that's using sort of brand-related search queries, sending those out to search engines and finding the pages that come back and looking for relevant domains within that. So we kind of use a variety of sources to try and give as comprehensive coverage as we can get. And in so doing, we're looking not just for domains containing the brand name, but we also look for variations and typos. So our domain monitoring tool can use things like wildcard characters to look for sort of variations, the sorts of things that might be used by an infringer. And infringers will use and abuse domain names in a variety of ways, which we'll come on to on the next slide, so I won't talk about that too much now. The other sort of really kind of key point to note about domain monitoring is, obviously, if you're looking for a particular type of infringement, you could get the same type of infringement on a branded domain name as you could get on a regular kind of web page that doesn't necessarily have the brand and domain name. But obviously, the branded domain infringements tend to be the ones that are kind of the highest risk, if you like. They tend to be highly visible in terms of being more highly ranked in search engines. They're clear abuses of IP, and then everything else being equal, there tend to be more enforcement options available for a branded domain than for a sort of general random website. And again, Lan will talk a little bit about that later, I suggest. So yeah.
Thanks, DB. So there's a lot of different things an infringer can do with a brand's domain, as we've mentioned. And we've seen some pretty interesting stuff, from fake sites to competition scams to username and password phishing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Chris, yeah, as you say, I mean, if a third party is going to be registering a branded domain name, there can, in general terms, be a number of different things they're planning to do with that.
Yeah.
I guess one of the highest risk things is where they're trying to sort of pass themselves off as being or representing the brand. So, you know, you can think of things like fraudulent or phishing sites that are using official branding to sell counterfeit goods. So in those cases, they're kind of using the brand in the domain name kind of to pretend to be that brand, if you like.
Pass off.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But we do see a range of different types of infringement, and some of those are kind of suggested by the kind of keywords on the slide here. There can be a range of things. So things like traffic misdirection, so someone who's using a branded domain name, but actually when you go to the website, it actually redirects you, for example, to a third-party site. So that's kind of like a brand seeding type issue. There may be issues of things like potential brand confusion. So those may be, you know, two or more companies actually that are legitimately using the brand name that are maybe coexisting. And there may be issues to do with trademark coverage as to whether that actually constitutes an infringement or not. There may be sites that are using a branded domain name to imply some sort of claim of affiliation. There may be someone claiming to be a service provider for a particular kind of category of branded goods and so on.
Yeah.
Beyond that, you know, we often find that there are lots of branded domain names we set up where there is actually no live content at the moment. And again, they can be kind of still misused in a number of ways. Even when there's no kind of live content on the site, sometimes we find that an infringer will actually monetize that site by putting on sponsored ads or pay-per-click ads. So actually, even while there's no kind of active content, they're still generating revenue through that site. And that can be particularly concerning where those pay-per-click ads actually direct maybe to competitor websites. I guess probably one of the sort of most sort of sinister things, if you like, that we do sometimes also see is one where there's apparently no live content at all, but actually someone has registered that domain name to actually use it as the from address in an email. So again, that's often associated with kind of phishing or advanced fee fraud. So in those cases, we can look for things like the presence of an MX record to see whether the domain has been activated for its email functionality.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, we've seen really interesting patterns with what infringers are doing, and one particular brand that I worked with that we actually identified cross-industry was where they were taking the brand names, they were putting numbers in the domain, and they were promoting themselves in an undesired region. And what we did was we took the keywords and the number pattern that they were using in the domain and put that into our monitoring so that we were looking for that. We've also had challenges with brands who use just acronyms in their brand. And so they're more difficult to kind of just look for because obviously there's going to be thousands of variations, right?
So that's actually kind of a really nice example where actually once the brand monitoring service gets going, we actually use the intelligence derived from that to actually proactively sort of evolve the monitoring to look for the types of infringements that we know the criminals out there are actually using.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a big part of what we do with the domain monitoring that you can't really do through just portfolio management. And when we came across the infringements that we've been talking about, it's all about kind of implementing that into the scanning and looking for those types of infringement, identifying what the trends are, looking at different methodologies that they're using so that we can keep our monitoring fluid and provide support in those areas.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a process we tend to call tuning for a live service. It's making sure that the service remains focused, it's kept up to date with the types of things we're actually seeing out there in the wild.
Exactly. So I think that phishing is usually at the top of a brand owner's priority, simply because of the impact on the customers as well as the brand's reputation. And there's a lot of sensitivity around customer data to consider, especially since the developments of the GDPR.
Yeah.
So we've got a number of things that are pretty concerning about this particular issue. We've got a branded domain that's requesting personal details. It's got corporate branding, and there's a brand logo and brand name being used in the content of the website itself. This is where we begin to think about action.
Absolutely. This is where we should look into the enforcement action. Given like the domain name, it does have the brand name in, it actually requests personal information, and also it makes use of the corporate branding and also the brand logo and brand name. It's a highly risky domain name. Therefore, we do need to kind of see we can hit it really heavy-handed. As you know, like the domain name is very unique, and also like it does attract attention from the visitors, assuming that's actually a legitimate domain name. That's why we wanted to hit it with a registrar action. So the registrar action is normally most applicable when it's when the domain name is involved for fraud, and phishing. Obviously, we do need to do a very thorough investigation to ensure the domain name is not compromised and the registrant of the domain name is not a victim themselves. So we naturally carry out all the investigation where we can. And if we are absolutely sure everything is created for just the phishing purpose, we will hit the registrar. Obviously, as DB already suggested earlier, that the domain name itself doesn't have to resolve to any active content. It can actually be used to send fake email. Typically, they can be used for advanced emails and then like a recruitment scam emails. Various kinds like emails can be sent from those like a fake domain. That's why we do also, for example, investigate the email header information. So we then can approach the registrar and confirming the domain name itself is actually being used for fraud.
You're essentially providing evidence to that.
Absolutely. So apart from the registrar action, what else could we do? Of course, there will be something we can do. It will be the host action. It normally applies when the registrar is non-compliant or when we suspect a domain name has been actually compromised by a third-party unknown individual or a criminal. And quite often, it also comes into the form of the malware issues, or sometimes it can be document download that actually does consist of a malware. And that's where we do go to the host actually, because we want to ensure everything on the servers can also be removed as well. Sometimes we also go to the host for phishing issues, as we mentioned before, because the registrar is not compliant or the website we suspect has been compromised. That it also kind of suggests a registrant, it might not have been aware of a breach of their back-end security. So as an ethical organization, we also want to make sure they are aware of the issue fully.
Okay, so thank you, Lan. Let's move on to brand and logo abuse. We're going to be talking about the kinds of things we've been seeing and break down some examples too. Now, there's a vast amount of different types of brand and logo abuse online, and we've seen all kinds of weird and not so wonderful IP issues in this area. There's going to be standard logo abuse for most brands across the board, but some will be unique and to their industry, and some will differ in concern level. DB, I know you discussed these kinds of examples and concern levels in your book that you broke down quite well.
Yeah, so I mean, in general terms, I guess what we've got here is the sort of range of different types of infringement that you can find in general internet content, and I guess it's no kind of coincidence that a lot of these are the same as we've seen in the previous section on domains. Essentially, domain abuse is just a sort of subset of general internet abuse.
Exactly.
So here we've got things like brand seeding or traffic misdirection, which is where a brand name is used on a website that actually relates to a third party, for example, and that can be associated with all sorts of different types of content. It could be driving traffic to a competitor. It could be as part of a claim of affiliation. It could be on a site which is providing an undesirable brand association, so brand association with gambling or pornography, things like that. We've got things like site framing, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later. We've got general claims of affiliation, so things like client claims, partnership claims, sponsorship claims. And again, in those cases, a lot of what we find typically will tend to be legitimate content, but in those cases, we will tend to report those things to the brand owner so that they can check that those relationships are being cited in a compliant way that they're happy with. And it kind of, as you say, at the centre of this, we've got logo abuse because, we can get all of these types of infringement both with or without the logo, but if the logo is also present, then it tends to give that infringement a greater impact or greater level of significance. We can, of course, also have logo issues in isolation, so things like sites where you can download high-quality versions of a logo. So again, those can be of concern. Exactly, yeah. Those can be of concern because they're unauthorized distribution of intellectual property. They can be used by criminals trying to create a fake site and so on. But I guess kind of taking all things together, infringements where there are logos present can fall into a sort of variety of kind of hierarchies or levels of severity, as you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah.
So sort of at the bottom, we've got a kind of low threat content, sort of generic, neutral content. So that might be a logo use on a news story that's talking about the brand. So generally not something that is concerning, not something you want to take action against. Kind of one step up from that are things like the medium threat infringement. So that may be a logo being used in conjunction with a claim of affiliation, an issue of brand seeding, something like that. Yeah. And then at the top of that, we've got our high threat kind of categories of content. So those will be things like our passing off, so sites that are maybe trying to engage in phishing, that are geared towards the sale of counterfeits. And alongside that, we've got other types of infringement that are maybe not so easily actionable, but where maybe, for example, you've got a logo being used in conjunction with negative comment or boycott activity. And sometimes in those types of cases, what we'll see is sometimes the logo even is modified in such a way so as to sort of promote a negative image of that brand, so using kind of negative imagery, negative keywords alongside that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of, it's an interesting one because we expect to see certain things across the board for a lot of brands, but when we put the monitoring in place and we start working with them, we usually uncover specific or unique infringements to their industry or sometimes even to the brand itself. So where we've worked with universities, we've seen infringing documentation.
Absolutely.
Where we've worked with betting companies, we've seen Chinese fake sites that are marketed in China. And we've even worked with electronics manufacturer where they had a huge tech support problem, where there were these tech support companies or fake tech support companies that were using the brand's logo, they were using the brand name and saying that they could provide tech support services. They were remoting to customer machines. And they were, there was instances where they would build thousands of dollars and installing viruses on their computers, and this simply started from a tech support ad.
Absolutely. So you've got all of the issues of security, social engineering, all of those types of things potentially going on as well.
Exactly. So it just goes to show how you can, monitoring can uncover like a small thing that then ends up being a kind of a bit of a rabbit hole, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess that's always sort of been our mindset, and that's why it's so important to have a holistic approach.
Yeah.
Kind of look for everything, and it's only kind of when you get into the kind of the meat of a particular service that you know what are the particular issues that are affecting that particular client and that particular industry, because it's not always the same, and it's not always what you expect.
Yeah, and so we take this approach with our investigation work too, right?
Yeah.
We look at linguistic analysis, for example, where we take keywords from certain infringers, whether they use like a specific kind of weird or unique phrase, and then we can implement that into the monitoring and try and find if they have any other websites. In some cases, we've found where they've taken assets from other official websites that are legitimate, and there's all kinds of different interesting things that can come out of this kind of monitoring and, is identified from the logo abuse that we've seen for brands.
And this is a bit like what we were talking about earlier. Actually, once you set the service up, you get to know sort of the pattern of the infringers, and you can use that knowledge to actually tune the monitoring going forward.
Exactly. So DB, let's take a closer look at framing, because this is one that came up with one of my clients recently, and we provided a piece on where framing came from and how it's used to kind of frame official websites.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who've sort of kind of not come across framing before, essentially what it is, it's where an official website is sort of displayed in an embedded form on a third-party website, and that's all kind of defined within the HTML source code. There's kind of a number of issues around that, one of which is that the site that's actually doing the framing can impose their own branding using like a border or a header over the official site. So essentially, it's kind of like a dilution of the official branding. The other kind of really concerning edge to it is that when you're looking at a site that's framed, actually the address you see in the address bar of your browser is actually the URL of the site that's doing the framing rather than the site that's being framed. So you as a user have no real indication what site you're actually interacting with when you're actually dealing with the site within the frame. So if you're kind of navigating through that site, the URL potentially is not changing, and actually all you're seeing is the URL of the site that you're kind of interacting through. So there's all sorts of issues around with that. There's the possibility that they could be monitoring your traffic in some way, and also, of course, there's no guarantee that the site you think you're actually interacting with is the legitimate site. So if you've gone to, say, an online banking site through some sort of directory that frames that site, you don't actually know whether you're looking at the legitimate site or, a duplicate copycat version of it. So kind of for all these reasons, we tend to sort of educate and encourage our brand owners to consider framing of their own site as kind of, it's not necessarily infringement, but it's bad practice, and we would sort of encourage them to discourage their partners from framing their site in that way.
So what we should do now is kind of walk you guys through type of action we could do for something like this. So Lan, when we've got a framing issue where there's an unbranded domain that's got competitor links, use of brand logo and sponsored links, what are the options here?
So obviously, investigation is always going to be the key thing we need to do first, because like even though it's a branded domain name, you still need to be absolutely sure the domain name itself is not created entirely for the purpose of for fraud.
Okay.
But there will also be like instances where, like DB suggested earlier, it could be an affiliate actually create the domain name and framing the official site, and they should be discouraged to do so. So we first step is always to double check what is the registration background. If there's any way we can verify the information. Once we have done so, then we can decide whether we hit them really hard, registrar action, or if we actually identify the sponsor links direct us to, for example, like the other dodgy websites or containing any kind of malicious like software, and or like directing us to other competitors, then depending on that, we could potentially send a cease and desist to registrants if we believe the infringement is less serious than like a fraud or like a phishing. But if it's potentially an affiliate issue, that's when we need to kind of report back to the brand owner, and maybe this is something they need to deal with internally, because this may actually damage their relationship if we take the enforcement action. Obviously, we can be very, very flexible around that, but the first key is always to ensure we do our investigation, identify who's the registrant, what is the background information, and what does the website tell you.
Awesome. Thanks, Lan. I want to quickly touch on the impact now, because I think this is really important. And this links back to our initial points regarding the three important areas for the brand owners that work with us. We know that there are a lot of ways that an infringer or a scammer can use a brand logo or a domain in ways that will impact the brand. And so obviously we talked previously about establishing your brand online and protecting your corporate image and also protecting the brand. And so, you know, to kind of give you guys a bit of an idea as to, you know, how significant these dangers can be. We've got a few stats here. So customers are 42% less likely to interact with a brand after being phished or spoofed. Email fraud is up to 45% conversion rate. CEO scams have cost companies $2.3 billion over the period of around 2 years. And 97% of people globally can't correctly identify a sophisticated phishing email, which actually kind of makes you think about how they probably aren't, you know, very good at identifying sophisticated websites either with domains with the brand name in the domain. So those are three areas that I think are really important and something that should be considered when looking at your brand and when looking at your portfolio as to, you know, why you might want to have monitoring in place.
I guess that brings up a really interesting point about sort of return on investment as well. I mean, you know, obviously having a brand protection program in place, you know, it is an expenditure for a brand owner, but, you know, all of the things you've discussed there, Chris, is actually, these are the sorts of things that can have direct financial impact on a brand owner. So, you know, there is a real cost of not having this type of protection in place.